The music had already started, and the Duke of Ashcombe was standing so still that he looked like one of the marble statues lining the ballroom wall. 3 years had passed since his wife had died, yet every time a violin began to play, his chest tightened as though the loss had happened only that morning. He had come to this ball because his sister had insisted, not because he wanted to be there. He would rather have stayed home with his books and his silence. Edmund Ashworth was 34 years old, tall, and still handsome in the way that made young women whisper behind their fans. But none of that mattered to him anymore. Titles, looks, wealth, these things had once made his life feel full. Now they felt like heavy chains that kept him standing in ballrooms he did not want to attend, wearing a face that did not match what he felt inside. His sister, Margaret, found him near the tall windows, where the candlelight barely reached. She touched his arm gently, the way she always did when she was about to say something he did not want to hear. "You cannot keep hiding in corners, Edmund," she said. "People are starting to talk." "Let them talk," he answered. "They have talked for 3 years. I doubt anything I do now will change their opinion of me." Margaret sighed, but she did not argue further. She knew her brother well enough to understand that pushing him only made him retreat further into himself. Instead, she simply stayed beside him, watching the dancers move across the polished floor in bright circles of silk and laughter. Edmund watched too, though he tried not to. There was something about the dancing that both drew him in and pushed him away. He remembered how his wife, Isabel, used to laugh when she missed a step. He remembered the warmth of her hand in his, the way she used to tease him for being too serious. Those memories had once been comforting. Now they felt like open wounds that never fully closed. He turned his gaze away from the dance floor and toward the long table set with refreshments, thinking perhaps a glass of wine might make the evening pass more quickly. As he moved through the crowd, several guests nodded politely, though none dared approach him directly. It had been this way for a long time. People respected him, even admired him, but they also feared him, or perhaps they feared his sadness. Grief made people uncomfortable, and so they kept their distance, as though sorrow might be something they could catch like a cold. He accepted a glass from a footman and stood near a pillar, half hidden from the main crowd. From this spot, he could observe the room without being seen too clearly himself. It was a habit he had developed over the years, a way of attending events without truly being present in them. It was from this same shadowed spot that he first noticed her. She was not dancing. She stood near the edge of the floor, watching the other guests with an expression that was different from anyone else in the room. She did not look bored, and she did not look nervous the way most young ladies did when they were new to society and unsure of where to stand or whom to speak with. Instead, she looked curious, almost amused, as though she found the entire spectacle of the ball rather entertaining rather than intimidating. She wore a simple gown of pale blue, far less elaborate than the gowns of the other women present, yet somehow it suited her better than their expensive silks and jewels suited them. Her hair was arranged neatly, but without the elaborate curls that were currently fashionable. She looked, Edmund thought, like someone who had wandered into the wrong party and did not mind at all. He did not know who she was. That alone was unusual, since he had attended enough of these events to recognize most of the families that mattered in London society. He assumed she must be a guest of someone important, perhaps a relative visiting from the countryside. He watched her for longer than he intended to. There was something refreshing about her stillness, the way she did not seem desperate to be noticed the way so many young women at these events were. She simply watched the room, sometimes smiling faintly at something amusing she observed, sometimes tilting her head as though studying the dancer's steps. At one point, her eyes swept across the room and landed briefly on him. For a moment their gazes met. Edmund expected her to look away quickly, the way most people did when they realized they were looking at the Duke of Ashcombe, the man everyone whispered about but no one wanted to approach. Instead, she held his gaze for a heartbeat longer than was polite, as though she were studying him the same way she had been studying everyone else. Then she offered the smallest of smiles, not overly friendly, but not distant either, before turning her attention back to the dancers. Edmund felt something strange in his chest, something he had not felt in years. It was not quite happiness, but it was close to curiosity, and curiosity itself felt foreign to him now. He found himself wondering who she was, and why she stood there watching everything so calmly, while the rest of the room buzzed with gossip and ambition. Margaret appeared at his side again, following his gaze. "Ah," she said knowingly, "you have noticed Miss Winters." "Who?" Edmund asked, trying to sound uninterested, though his sister's raised eyebrow told him he had failed. "Charlotte Winters," Margaret explained. "She is the daughter of a merchant, recently arrived in London under the sponsorship of Lady Fenwick. Quite an unusual addition to society, if the rumors are to be believed." "What rumors?" Margaret smiled slightly. "That she speaks her mind far too often for a woman without a title, and that she has already turned down 2 proposals from perfectly respectable gentlemen, because she found them, in her words, dull." Edmund almost laughed, an action so unfamiliar to him now that it startled even himself. "Dull," he repeated. "That seems a rather bold reason to refuse a proposal." "Bold is certainly one word for Miss Winters," Margaret said. "Foolish is another word some might use. A woman in her position cannot afford to be too particular." Edmund said nothing more, but his eyes drifted back toward the young woman by the dance floor. She had moved slightly, now speaking with an older woman he recognized as Lady Fenwick, her sponsor for the season. Even from a distance, he could see the way Charlotte listened attentively, nodding at whatever Lady Fenwick was saying, though her eyes still occasionally drifted back toward the dancers with clear interest. The evening continued much as it always did. Guests came to greet Edmund out of obligation, offering polite condolences disguised as compliments, careful never to mention his wife directly, but always somehow implying that they remembered his loss. He responded to each with the same practiced words, thanking them for their concern, assuring them he was managing well enough, though every conversation left him feeling more tired than the last. Through it all, he found his attention returning again, and again to the young woman in pale blue. She did not dance either, he noticed, though several gentlemen approached her throughout the evening. She spoke with them politely, sometimes laughing at something they said, but she always seemed to find a reason to excuse herself before any of them could lead her to the dance floor. It was strange, Edmund thought, for a young woman new to society to avoid dancing at a ball meant precisely for that purpose. He wondered if she disliked dancing, or if perhaps, like him, she simply found something uncomfortable in the entire ritual of it, the way it required a person to be watched so closely by everyone around them. As the night wore on, Edmund found himself growing restless in a way he had not felt in years. He was used to standing quietly through these events, waiting for an acceptable moment to leave without causing offense. Tonight, however, something kept pulling his attention back toward the far side of the room, toward the young woman who seemed just as out of place among the glittering crowd as he felt himself. He told himself it was merely curiosity, nothing more. A man could be curious about a stranger without it meaning anything significant. Yet even as he reasoned with himself, he found his eyes searching the crowd for her whenever she moved out of view, and he felt an unexpected disappointment each time she disappeared behind a group of chattering guests. Near midnight, as the orchestra began a slower piece, Edmund noticed Charlotte standing near the refreshment table again, this time alone. Lady Fenwick had wandered off to speak with another group of guests, leaving Charlotte with a few moments to herself. She picked up a small glass of lemonade and turned to look out toward the dance floor, her expression thoughtful. For reasons he could not fully explain, Edmund found himself walking in her direction before he had consciously decided to do so. He was several steps closer before his usual caution returned, reminding him that approaching an unmarried young woman he had never been introduced to would raise questions he did not wish to answer. He stopped himself just short of her, standing instead near the same table, close enough to be noticed but not so close as to seem forward. Charlotte glanced at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then she surprised him by speaking first. "You have been watching the dancers all evening, Your Grace," she said, her voice calm and unbothered by the fact that she was addressing a duke without a formal introduction. Yet you have not danced a single time." Edmund blinked, caught off guard by her directness. Most people did not speak to him so plainly, especially not about a subject as personal as his refusal to dance. "Neither have you, Miss Winters," he replied, deciding to match her honesty rather than retreat into polite deflection. A small smile touched her lips. "You know my name." "My sister mentioned it," he admitted. "She seems to find you quite an interesting topic of conversation." "I imagine most of London finds me an interesting topic of conversation," Charlotte said, though there was no bitterness in her tone, only amusement. "A merchant's daughter attending balls meant for lords and ladies. It is rather scandalous, or so I am told." "And does that trouble you?" She considered the question seriously, as though it deserved real thought rather than a quick, polite answer. "Not particularly," she said finally. "I would rather be talked about for being myself than admired for pretending to be someone I am not." Edmund found himself studying her more closely now, noting the steady confidence in her eyes, so different from the nervous glances most young women gave him. "That is a rare way of thinking in a room like this." "Perhaps," she said, "but I have found that most rare things are worth having." She paused, glancing toward the dance floor once more. "Though I confess, I do wonder why a man who once, I am told, loved dancing so much has not taken a single turn about the floor tonight." Edmund's chest tightened slightly at her words, but he did not look away. There was something about her tone that did not feel like gossip or pity. It felt genuinely curious, as though she truly wanted to understand rather than simply repeat rumors she had heard. "Dancing reminds me of things I would rather not remember tonight," he said quietly, surprising himself with his own honesty. Charlotte's expression softened, though she did not offer the usual sympathetic words he had grown so tired of hearing. Instead, she simply nodded, as though she understood without needing further explanation. "Then perhaps tonight is not the night for it," she said. "There is no rule that says a person must dance simply because the music is playing." Her words settled over him in a way he had not expected. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel pressured to explain himself further, nor did he feel the need to apologize for his grief. She had given him permission, in a strange way, simply to exist as he was without demanding that he change or perform happiness he did not feel. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "For not telling me it has been long enough," he said. "Everyone else seems to believe there is a proper amount of time for sorrow, after which a man should simply return to his old self." Charlotte's eyes held his for a long moment. "Grief does not follow anyone's calendar, Your Grace," she said. "I do not believe it can be rushed simply, because others grow tired of waiting." Before Edmund could respond, Lady Fenwick returned, slightly breathless from her conversation across the room, and the moment between them shifted back into the polite formality expected of strangers. Charlotte offered him a small, respectful curtsy, and Edmund returned a bow, both of them stepping back into the roles society expected of them. Yet as Edmund walked away from the refreshment table, he found that something inside him had shifted, however slightly. For the first time in 3 years, he found himself thinking not about the wife he had lost, but about the strange, unafraid young woman who had spoken to him as though he were simply a man, rather than a title wrapped in sorrow. He did not dance that night, but for the first time in a very long while, he left a ball wondering if he might attend the next one, not out of obligation, but out of a quiet hope that he might see her there again. Charlotte Winters had not expected London to feel so much like a stage where everyone performed a role they did not truly believe in. She had grown up in a house filled with the honest noise of trade, where her father discussed prices and shipments openly at the dinner table, where servants spoke freely, and where no one pretended to be anything other than what they were. London society, by contrast, felt like a carefully constructed play, full of smiles that did not reach the eyes and compliments that hid quiet insults. She had come to London at the urging of her father, Mr. Winters, a successful merchant who had built his fortune through hard work and careful decisions. He wanted his only daughter to have opportunities he never had, connections that might elevate the family name beyond trade and into something more permanent. Lady Fenwick, a distant cousin on her mother's side, had agreed to sponsor Charlotte for the season, introducing her to society in hopes of securing a respectable match. Charlotte had agreed to come, though not entirely for the reasons her father hoped. She was curious about this world of titles and ballrooms, the world she had only read about in books and heard about from women who had married into it. She wanted to see it for herself, to understand whether the glittering surface hid something more meaningful underneath, or whether it was simply glass all the way through. So far, her conclusions had been mixed. The morning after the ball, Charlotte sat in the small drawing room of Lady Fenwick's townhouse, sipping tea while her cousin reviewed the guest list for an upcoming dinner party. Lady Fenwick was a warm woman, if a bit obsessed with propriety, and she had taken to Charlotte with genuine affection, even as she despaired over her young cousin's tendency to speak too plainly in company. "You spoke with the Duke of Ashcombe last night," Lady Fenwick said, not looking up from her list, though her tone made clear this was not a casual observation. "I did," Charlotte replied simply, setting down her teacup. "Charlotte, dear, do you understand what that means? The Duke of Ashcombe has not spoken privately with an unmarried woman in 3 years, not since his wife passed. People will talk." "People talk regardless of what I do," Charlotte said. "I have found that the surest way to lose one's mind in this city is to worry over every word that might be repeated at someone else's dinner table." Lady Fenwick sighed, setting down her pen. "You are clever, Charlotte, and I do admire your spirit, but cleverness alone will not secure your future here. You must learn to be more careful." Charlotte considered her cousin's words seriously, even if she did not fully agree with them. She understood that Lady Fenwick meant well, that she genuinely wanted to see Charlotte settled happily and securely. But Charlotte could not bring herself to regret the conversation she had shared with the Duke. There had been something honest in it, something rare in a city built on careful performances. "He seemed lonely," Charlotte said quietly. "Beneath all the formality, I mean. He seemed like a man who has forgotten how to simply exist without the weight of everyone's expectations." Lady Fenwick's expression softened slightly. "Grief changes people, Charlotte. Edmund Ashworth was not always so withdrawn. Before his wife died, he was known for his warmth, his laughter. Now he attends events out of duty alone, and most people have simply accepted that this is who he has become." "But is it who he wishes to be?" Charlotte asked. Lady Fenwick had no answer for that, and the conversation moved on to other matters, though Charlotte found herself thinking about the Duke throughout the rest of the day. There was something about the brief exchange between them that lingered in her mind, not because he was a duke, and certainly not because of his fortune or title, but because of the quiet honesty in his voice when he had thanked her for not pretending his grief should already be finished. Over the following days, Charlotte attended several more social gatherings, each one blending into the next with the same familiar pattern of introductions, polite conversation, and careful observation from every corner of the room. She met young gentlemen eager to secure her attention, drawn perhaps by her novelty as much as by any genuine interest in who she truly was. She danced when it seemed unavoidable, though she found little joy in the rigid formality of it, the careful counting of steps, and the forced conversation that filled the pauses between movements. She did not see the Duke again for nearly a week, though she found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, watching for him at each event she attended. When she finally did see him again, it was at a garden party hosted by one of Lady Fenwick's friends, a sprawling estate just outside the city where guests wandered among carefully trimmed hedges and blooming flower beds, while musicians played softly from a distance. Edmund stood near a fountain, engaged in what appeared to be a rather tense conversation with an older gentleman Charlotte did not recognize. She watched from a distance as the older man gestured emphatically, clearly trying to persuade the Duke of something, while Edmund's posture remained stiff and unyielding. She learned later, through overheard conversation among other guests, that the man was a distant relative of the Duke's, one who had been pressing him for months to remarry, arguing that the Ashcombe title required an heir, and that continued mourning served no practical purpose. The idea of love or grief being weighed against practical necessity struck Charlotte as deeply unfair, though she understood that such considerations were common enough among the aristocracy, where marriages were often built more on duty than affection. When the older gentleman finally walked away, clearly frustrated, Edmund remained by the fountain, his shoulders tense, his expression carefully controlled but unmistakably weary. Charlotte hesitated only a moment before making her way toward him. Ignoring the small voice in her head that reminded her such directness was not considered proper for a young lady in her position. "You look as though you have just survived a battle, Your Grace," she said as she approached. Edmund turned, and for a brief moment, surprise flickered across his features before settling into something closer to relief. "In a manner of speaking, I suppose I have," he said. "My uncle believes that grief has an appropriate expiration date, after which a man should simply move forward as though nothing significant occurred." "And what do you believe?" Charlotte asked, settling beside him near the edge of the fountain, close enough for conversation but respectfully distant. Edmund considered the question for a long moment, watching the water ripple gently in the afternoon light. "I believe grief does not disappear simply because enough time has passed," he said finally. "It changes, perhaps. It becomes quieter, less overwhelming. But I do not think it vanishes entirely, nor do I think it should be forced away before a person is ready." Charlotte nodded, understanding the weight behind his words more than she could easily express. "My mother passed when I was 12, she said quietly. "People told me even then that I would forget the pain eventually, that time would heal everything completely. It never fully did. I simply learned to carry it differently." Edmund looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something between surprise and gratitude, as though her honesty had given him permission to feel understood rather than judged. "I am sorry for your loss," he said. "And I for yours," she replied simply. They stood together in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the water in the fountain catch the sunlight, neither feeling the need to fill the quiet with unnecessary conversation. It was a strange thing, Charlotte thought, how comfortable silence could feel with the right person, when with others even simple conversation felt exhausting and forced. "May I ask you something rather bold, Miss Winters?" Edmund said eventually. "You may certainly ask," Charlotte replied, "though I cannot promise you will enjoy my answer." A faint smile touched his lips, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "Why have you refused to dance at every event you have attended this season? My sister mentioned it, and I confess I have noticed it myself." Charlotte considered her answer carefully, deciding that honesty seemed the only fair response to his own openness. "Dancing here feels like a performance," she said. "Everyone watching, judging, comparing. I do not dislike dancing itself. I simply dislike dancing as a display rather than as something enjoyed for its own sake." "That is remarkably similar to how I feel about it as well," Edmund admitted. "Though for different reasons." "Perhaps that is why neither of us have danced this season," Charlotte said, a teasing note entering her voice for the first time. Edmund's smile widened slightly, and for a moment the weariness in his expression seemed to lift, replaced by something lighter, something almost hopeful. "Perhaps," he agreed. Their conversation was interrupted shortly after by Lady Fenwick, who approached with a slightly worried expression, clearly having noticed the length of time Charlotte had spent speaking privately with the Duke. Charlotte excused herself politely, offering Edmund a small curtsy before allowing her cousin to lead her toward a group of other young ladies gathered near the garden's rose beds. As they walked away, Lady Fenwick spoke quietly, her tone a mixture of concern and curiosity. "You seem to have made quite an impression on the Duke, Charlotte. 2 private conversations within a week is enough to start serious talk among the other guests." "We were simply speaking, cousin," Charlotte said. "There is no scandal in conversation." "There is scandal in everything when it involves a duke as prominent as Edmund Ashworth," Lady Fenwick replied, though her tone carried more concern for Charlotte's well-being than genuine disapproval. "I only wish for you to be careful, my dear. Men in his position, even good men, cannot always follow their own hearts. Duty often demands otherwise. Charlotte considered her cousin's warning seriously, understanding the truth within it even as she felt a small, stubborn resistance rising within her. She had come to London prepared to observe this strange, glittering world from a respectful distance, never intending to become entangled in its complicated rules and expectations. Yet something about her conversations with the Duke felt different from everything else she had experienced since her arrival, something real amid so much careful performance. She did not know what, if anything, might come from these brief encounters. But she found herself hoping, quietly and perhaps foolishly, that she might see him again soon, and that their next conversation might reveal even more of the man hidden beneath the weight of his title and his grief. That evening, as Charlotte prepared for bed, she found herself thinking not about the elaborate gowns or jewels she had seen at the garden party, nor about the various young gentlemen who had sought her attention throughout the afternoon. Instead, her thoughts remained fixed on a quiet conversation beside a fountain, and the rare, genuine smile of a man who seemed to be slowly remembering what it felt like to be understood. She did not yet know how deeply their lives would soon become intertwined, nor the challenges that awaited them both in the weeks to come. For now, she simply allowed herself the small, comforting thought that perhaps, in a city full of careful performances, she had found one person willing to be honest with her, even if only for a few stolen moments beside a fountain. The Fenwick townhouse grew louder than usual on the morning the invitation arrived. Lady Fenwick's youngest housemaid delivered it directly to the breakfast table, her cheeks flushed with the excitement of carrying such an important piece of paper. Lady Fenwick broke the seal immediately, scanning the elegant handwriting before letting out a small, delighted gasp. "The Ashcombe Ball," she said, setting the invitation down carefully as though it might shatter. "Edmund Ashworth is hosting a ball at Ashcombe Hall. This has not happened in 3 years, Charlotte, not since before his wife passed." Charlotte looked up from her tea, genuinely surprised. "He is hosting an event himself, at his own home." "Indeed," Lady Fenwick said, still staring at the invitation as though she could hardly believe it. "This is significant, my dear. Duke Ashworth has attended events out of obligation for years, but he has never hosted one himself, not since Isabel's passing. This changes things considerably." Charlotte felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at the news, though she tried to keep her expression neutral, uncertain of what such an event might mean, both for London society and for whatever strange, tentative connection had begun to form between herself and the Duke. She thought of their conversation beside the fountain, his quiet admission about grief not following any calendar, and wondered if perhaps something within him had begun to shift. Over the following days, London society buzzed with anticipation for the Ashcombe Ball. Everyone seemed to have a theory about why the reclusive Duke had suddenly decided to open his home for such a grand event. Some believed his family had finally convinced him of the necessity of remarrying and producing an heir. Others whispered that perhaps he intended to announce some significant decision regarding the estate itself. Still others, though fewer in number, wondered quietly whether a certain merchant's daughter might have something to do with his sudden change of heart. Charlotte tried her best to ignore these rumors, though they proved difficult to avoid entirely, given how often they were repeated within earshot at every gathering she attended. She focused instead on preparing for the event itself, allowing Lady Fenwick to fuss over her gown selection with far more enthusiasm than Charlotte herself felt necessary. "You must look your absolute best," Lady Fenwick insisted, holding up yet another bolt of fabric for Charlotte's inspection. "This ball will likely be the most talked-about event of the entire season." "I am attending a ball, cousin, not auditioning for a role in a play," Charlotte said, though she allowed herself to be fitted for a new gown regardless, understanding that resistance would only prolong the process unnecessarily. The gown Lady Fenwick eventually selected was a deep shade of green, simple in its design but elegant in its construction, complementing Charlotte's coloring without overwhelming her natural appearance with excessive decoration. Charlotte found she rather liked it, appreciating that it allowed her to feel comfortable rather than constrained, a quality she valued far more than fashionable extravagance. On the evening of the ball, Ashcombe Hall stood transformed from the quiet, somewhat somber estate Charlotte had heard described in whispered conversations into something bright and alive with candlelight and music. Carriages lined the long drive leading up to the grand entrance, and guests in their finest attire moved through the doors in steady streams, their excited chatter filling the cool evening air. Charlotte arrived alongside Lady Fenwick, both women stepping into a grand entrance hall lit by dozens of candles, their flames reflecting off polished marble floors and elegant mirrors lining the walls. The ballroom itself, when they finally entered, took Charlotte's breath away momentarily. Tall windows lined one entire wall, offering a view of carefully maintained gardens beyond, while an orchestra played softly from a raised platform at the far end of the room. It was clear that considerable effort had gone into preparing for this event, far more than Edmund's usual obligatory appearances at other people's parties might have suggested he was capable of. Charlotte wondered whether he had personally overseen these preparations, or whether his staff had simply been given instructions and left to manage the details themselves. She did not have to wonder for long. As guests continued arriving, Edmund appeared near the entrance to the ballroom, greeting each person personally, a duty he clearly found exhausting judging by the careful control evident in his expression, though he performed it with unwavering politeness regardless. When Charlotte and Lady Fenwick reached him in the receiving line, his expression shifted slightly, something warmer flickering briefly across his features before he composed himself back into formal courtesy. "Lady Fenwick, Miss Winters," he said, bowing slightly, "I am pleased you could attend this evening." "We would not have missed it for the world, Your Grace," Lady Fenwick replied warmly. "It has been far too long since Ashcombe Hall has hosted such a wonderful gathering." "Indeed," Edmund said, though his eyes lingered briefly on Charlotte as he spoke, "it has been quite some time." Charlotte offered a small curtsy, meeting his gaze directly rather than looking away as propriety might have suggested. "The hall looks beautiful this evening, Your Grace." "Thank you, Miss Winters," he said. "I hope you will enjoy the evening." Their exchange remained brief, appropriately formal given the crowd of guests waiting behind them. Yet Charlotte carried the warmth of his gaze with her as she moved further into the ballroom, finding a comfortable spot near the edge of the dance floor where she could observe the evening's proceedings without drawing excessive attention to herself. The ball progressed much as other events had throughout the season, filled with dancing, conversation, and the constant undercurrent of gossip that seemed to follow every gathering among London's elite. Charlotte spoke with several acquaintances she had made throughout the season, declined 2 invitations to dance from gentlemen she found pleasant enough but uninteresting, and generally observed the evening with her usual quiet curiosity. She noticed, however, that Edmund seemed different tonight than he had at previous events. Though he still avoided the dance floor himself, he moved through his own ballroom with a bit more ease than she had witnessed before, engaging in conversations that seemed to last longer than the brief, obligatory exchanges she had observed him having at other people's parties. Perhaps hosting the event within his own home, surrounded by familiar surroundings rather than the unfamiliar territory of someone else's grand estate, allowed him a measure of comfort that had been missing before. As the evening progressed toward its midpoint, the orchestra began a particularly lively piece, and many of the younger guests eagerly filled the dance floor, their laughter and energy bringing a vibrant liveliness to the room that had been noticeably absent from society events for the past several years. Charlotte watched from her usual spot near the windows, enjoying the display without any desire to join it herself. She noticed Edmund watching the dancers as well, from a position not far from where she stood. His expression carried a complicated mixture of emotions, something between wistfulness and genuine pleasure at witnessing such joy within his own home once again. Charlotte found herself moving toward him before she had fully decided to do so, drawn by an instinct she could not entirely explain, even to herself. "You seem to be enjoying watching them, even if you will not join them yourself," she observed, coming to stand beside him. Edmund glanced at her, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "It has been a long time since this house has held such energy," he admitted. "I had almost forgotten what it sounded like." "Perhaps it is time to remember more of it," Charlotte suggested gently. "Perhaps," Edmund said, though his tone carried a hesitation that suggested the idea felt more complicated than she might understand. "Though remembering comes with its own difficulties." Charlotte considered his words carefully before responding. "I do not believe remembering must always mean returning to exactly how things once were, Your Grace. Perhaps it simply means allowing new memories to exist alongside the old ones, rather than believing one must replace the other entirely." Edmund turned to look at her fully now, something in his expression shifting into genuine consideration rather than polite acknowledgement. "You speak as though you have given this considerable thought." "I have had years to consider such things," Charlotte said simply. "Grief teaches patience, if nothing else." They stood together in comfortable silence for several moments, watching the dancers continue their lively movements across the floor. Charlotte was acutely aware of his presence beside her, close enough that she could sense the warmth radiating from him, despite the careful distance they maintained between their bodies, appropriate for two people who had shared only a handful of conversations across several weeks. "Miss Winters," Edmund said eventually, his voice quieter now, "may I ask you something?" "Of course," Charlotte replied. "Do you believe a person can truly move forward from significant loss? Or do you believe some parts of us simply remain permanently changed, unable to fully return to who we once were?" Charlotte considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, understanding that his query carried weight far beyond simple curiosity. "I believe we are always changed by what we lose," she said finally. "But I do not believe change must always mean diminishment. Sometimes, I think, we become capable of holding both grief and joy simultaneously, rather than believing one must eliminate the other entirely." Edmund's expression softened considerably at her words, something like relief passing across his features. "That is a rather generous way of viewing such things." "Perhaps," Charlotte said, "though I have found generous perspectives tend to serve us better than harsh ones, particularly regarding matters as difficult as grief." Their conversation was interrupted, as such moments between them often seemed to be, by the arrival of another guest eager to speak with the Duke about some matter of business or social obligation. Charlotte excused herself politely, moving away to allow Edmund to attend to his duties as host, though she carried their exchange with her throughout the remainder of the evening. Later, as the ball began winding toward its conclusion and guests started making their farewells, Charlotte found herself near the grand staircase, waiting for Lady Fenwick to finish her lengthy goodbyes with several old friends she had encountered throughout the evening. It was there that Edmund found her again, having briefly escaped his own hosting duties. "I hope you enjoyed this evening, despite your continued refusal to dance," he said, a teasing note entering his voice that Charlotte had not heard from him before. "I enjoyed it a great deal, Your Grace," Charlotte replied honestly. "Though I confess I enjoyed our conversations far more than the dancing itself, which I suspect says more about my own preferences than any fault of the evening's entertainment." Edmund's smile widened slightly, genuine warmth reaching his eyes in a way that made Charlotte's chest tighten unexpectedly. "I find myself agreeing with that sentiment entirely, Miss Winters." Lady Fenwick appeared shortly after, finally ready to depart, and Charlotte offered Edmund a final curtsy before following her cousin toward the waiting carriage. As they rode home through the quiet streets of London, Lady Fenwick studied Charlotte with a curious, assessing expression. "You spoke with him a great deal tonight," she observed. "We spoke, yes," Charlotte agreed, choosing not to elaborate further, though she suspected her cousin could see more in her expression than she intended to reveal. "Charlotte, dear," Lady Fenwick said carefully, "I do not wish to discourage you, but I must remind you again of the realities of his position. A duke's remarriage, should he ever choose to pursue one, will be scrutinized carefully by his family and by society at large. Expectations regarding suitable matches for men of his standing rarely align with the daughters of merchants, regardless of personal affection. Charlotte listened to her cousin's warning with genuine consideration, understanding the truth within it even as something stubborn and hopeful continued to grow within her chest, refusing to be entirely extinguished by practical concerns. "I understand the realities, cousin," she said quietly. "I am not foolish enough to expect anything beyond friendship, if even that. But I do not regret our conversations, regardless of what may or may not come from them." Lady Fenwick said nothing further, though her expression carried a mixture of concern and quiet affection as she reached over to gently pat Charlotte's hand, the gesture speaking more than any additional words might have conveyed. That night, as Charlotte prepared for sleep, she found herself replaying their conversation beside the ballroom windows repeatedly in her mind, particularly his question about whether people could truly move forward from significant loss. She thought of her own mother's passing, of the years spent learning to carry that grief alongside whatever joy she managed to find in life afterward. She thought of Edmund's careful, guarded expression whenever the topic of his wife arose, the way sorrow still clearly lived close beneath the surface of his composed exterior. She did not know what the coming weeks might bring, whether their tentative connection would continue to grow, or whether practical realities would eventually pull them apart, exactly as Lady Fenwick had warned. But she found herself hoping, quietly and perhaps unwisely, that whatever came next might allow both of them the chance to discover whether grief and joy truly could exist together within the same heart, exactly as she had suggested to him earlier that evening. Weeks passed, and the tentative friendship between Charlotte and Edmund continued to develop, though always within the careful boundaries that society demanded. They encountered each other at various events throughout London, sometimes exchanging only brief pleasantries in crowded rooms, other times finding quiet moments for longer conversations away from the busiest parts of whatever gathering they happened to be attending. Charlotte found herself looking forward to these encounters more than she cared to admit, even to herself. There was something about Edmund's company that felt different from every other person she had met since arriving in London. He did not perform for her the way so many others did not attempt to impress her with wealth or status or clever, empty compliments. Instead, he spoke to her honestly, sharing thoughts and observations he seemed hesitant to share with others, as though her presence somehow made vulnerability feel safer than it did elsewhere. For his part, Edmund found himself thinking of Charlotte far more often than he had anticipated when their acquaintance first began. Her directness, which so many others in society found unsettling, felt refreshing to him after years of carefully guarded conversations filled with unspoken assumptions and polite dishonesty. She never treated him as though his grief made him fragile, nor did she treat him as though enough time had passed that he should simply return to his old self. She simply accepted him as he was, complicated feelings and all, and something about that acceptance allowed him to breathe more easily than he had in years. It was during a quiet afternoon garden gathering, hosted by one of Margaret's closest friends, that their growing connection took an unexpected turn. The event was smaller than most society gatherings, limited to close friends and family rather than the wider social circle that typically attended London's larger balls and parties. Charlotte had been invited through her connection with Lady Fenwick, while Edmund attended alongside his sister, who had specifically requested his presence for what she described as a much-needed break from his usual solitary routine. The afternoon proved pleasant, filled with light conversation, gentle walks through carefully maintained gardens, and the kind of relaxed atmosphere that larger, more formal events rarely allowed. Charlotte found herself walking alongside Margaret for much of the early afternoon, the two women discovering a genuine fondness for each other's company that surprised them both. "You have been good for my brother," Margaret said eventually, as they walked along a gravel path lined with blooming roses. "I have not seen him this engaged with the world in years, not since before Isabel passed." Charlotte felt a flush of warmth at the compliment, though she also felt a need to respond honestly. Rather than simply accepting praise she was not entirely certain she deserved. "I have done very little truly," she said, I have simply spoken with him honestly, without expectation that he perform recovery he does not feel. That is precisely what I mean, Margaret said, smiling gently. Everyone else in his life, myself included, has spent years either avoiding the topic of his grief entirely or pushing him to move past it more quickly than he was ready for. You have done neither. You have simply allowed him space to exist as he is, and that space seems to have given him room to breathe again. Charlotte considered Margaret's words carefully, understanding the weight of trust being placed in her through such an honest admission. "I care for your brother's well-being, Lady Margaret," she said finally. "Regardless of whatever else might or might not develop between us, I hope he continues finding that space to breathe, as you describe it." Margaret studied Charlotte's expression for a long moment before nodding, apparently satisfied with the sincerity she found there. "I believe you truly mean that," she said, "which is more than I can say for most people who seek my brother's attention, given his title and fortune." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Edmund himself, who had apparently finished a lengthy discussion with several other gentlemen regarding matters of estate management, and had come searching for his sister and her companion. Margaret, with a knowing smile that Charlotte suspected held more meaning than she let on, excused herself to rejoin the other guests, leaving Charlotte and Edmund alone on the garden path. "My sister seems quite taken with you," Edmund observed as they continued walking together at a comfortable pace. "She has been very kind," Charlotte replied. "I confess I have enjoyed her company a great deal this afternoon." "She tends to be an excellent judge of character," Edmund said, "better than most people I know, myself included." They walked in comfortable silence for several minutes, following the gravel path deeper into the garden, away from the main gathering of guests near the house. The afternoon sun filtered gently through overhanging tree branches, casting dappled shadows across the path ahead of them, and the quiet peacefulness of the setting seemed to encourage a deeper honesty than their previous conversations at crowded balls had allowed. "May I share something with you, Miss Winters?" Edmund asked eventually, his tone carrying a hesitance she had not heard from him before. "Of course," Charlotte replied, sensing the significance of whatever he was about to share. "I have not felt this at ease in another person's company since before Isabel passed," he said quietly. "I find myself looking forward to our conversations more than I know I should, given the circumstances of my position and your own." Charlotte's heart quickened slightly at his admission, though she took a moment to consider her response carefully, understanding the weight of honesty required in this particular exchange. "I feel similarly, Your Grace," she said finally, "though I confess I have worried about what such feelings might mean, given everything Lady Fenwick has warned me regarding the realities of your position." Edmund stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had seen from him in all their previous encounters. "What has Lady Fenwick warned you?" "That men in your position rarely choose partners based on personal affection alone," Charlotte said honestly. "That practical considerations of family and status typically outweigh such feelings, regardless of how genuine they might be." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some point in the distance as he considered her words. "My family has certainly made their expectations known regarding remarriage," he admitted finally. "They believe the Ashcombe title requires a proper heir, and that any future wife should come from a family of appropriate standing to secure that legacy." Charlotte felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced whenever Lady Fenwick's warnings about practical realities intruded upon the genuine connection she felt developing between herself and Edmund. "Then perhaps it is unwise for either of us to allow our feelings to develop further," she said, though the words felt heavy and reluctant even as she spoke them. "Perhaps," Edmund said, though his tone carried a resistance that matched her own reluctance. "Though I confess I have grown rather tired of allowing practical considerations to dictate every aspect of my life. I spent years allowing grief to control my existence, unable to move forward regardless of what others expected of me. I do not wish to now allow expectation to control my future in an equally rigid manner. Charlotte looked at him with genuine surprise, recognizing the significance of what he was suggesting, even if he had not yet stated it directly. "What are you saying, Your Grace?" Edmund took a step closer, close enough now that Charlotte could see the careful vulnerability in his eyes, the same expression she had glimpsed briefly during their very first conversation beside the refreshment table weeks earlier. "I am saying that I do not wish to dismiss whatever connection has developed between us simply because it complicates matters my family would prefer remained simple. I am saying that your honesty and your presence have brought more genuine happiness into my life over these past weeks than I believed myself capable of feeling again. And I am saying that I would like the opportunity to explore what this connection might become, regardless of the complications it may create." Charlotte's breath caught at his words, a mixture of hope and apprehension swirling within her chest. She had allowed herself to consider such possibilities in private moments, late at night when practical concerns felt less immediate and overwhelming. Hearing him speak such thoughts aloud, however, made the reality of the situation feel both more wonderful and more frightening than she had anticipated. "I would like that as well," she admitted quietly, "though I remain concerned about the difficulties such a connection might create, both for you and for myself." "I do not intend to pretend those difficulties do not exist," Edmund said. "But I have learned, through my own grief, that avoiding difficult things does not make them disappear. It simply delays the inevitable reckoning with whatever we have been avoiding. I would rather face these complications honestly than continue pretending my feelings for you do not exist." Charlotte felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, though they were tears of hope rather than sadness. "Your feelings for me," she repeated softly, testing the weight of his words. "Yes," Edmund confirmed, his voice steady despite the vulnerability evident in his expression. "My feelings for you, Charlotte. I do not know precisely what shape they might take, given the complications of my position and the expectations placed upon me. But I know they are genuine, and I know I do not wish to dismiss them simply because they are inconvenient." Their conversation was interrupted before Charlotte could respond fully, as the sound of approaching voices signaled that other guests had wandered further into the garden, likely searching for the two of them given their extended absence from the main gathering. Edmund stepped back slightly, re-establishing appropriate distance between them just as several other guests came into view along the garden path. Though their private conversation ended there, unfinished and interrupted, Charlotte carried the weight of Edmund's admission with her throughout the remainder of the afternoon and long into the evening that followed. She did not know what challenges awaited them as their connection continued developing, nor how Edmund's family and London society at large would eventually respond to whatever relationship might grow between a duke and a merchant's daughter. But for the first time since arriving in London, she allowed herself to hope, fully and without reservation, that perhaps something genuine and lasting might be possible between them, regardless of the obstacles that surely lay ahead. News of a grand ball at Lord Whitmore's estate spread through London society with unusual excitement, largely because it was rumored to be the final major event before many families departed the city for the quieter months of the countryside season. Lady Fenwick insisted that Charlotte attend, arguing that missing such a significant event would raise more questions than her attendance ever could, particularly given the growing whispers about her friendship with the Duke of Ashcombe. Charlotte agreed readily enough, though her reasons had little to do with the social significance Lady Fenwick emphasized. Since their conversation in the garden weeks earlier, she and Edmund had continued meeting whenever circumstances allowed, their connection deepening with each exchange, though they remained careful to maintain appropriate boundaries in public settings. She looked forward to seeing him again, curious whether the honest admission they had shared that afternoon might finally find some resolution. The Whitmore ballroom, when Charlotte arrived that evening, proved even more crowded and elaborate than the events she had attended earlier in the season. Chandeliers blazed overhead, casting brilliant light across gowns of every color imaginable, while the orchestra played with particular energy, clearly determined to make this final grand event memorable for everyone in attendance. Charlotte spotted Edmund almost immediately upon entering, standing near his usual shadowed position along the far wall, though she noticed something different in his posture tonight, a kind of restless energy that had not been present during their previous encounters at similar events. She made her way toward him gradually, pausing to exchange pleasantries with several acquaintances along the way, careful not to appear too eager despite the anticipation building within her chest. "You seem troubled tonight, Your Grace," she said quietly once she finally reached him, noting the tension visible in his shoulders and the careful way he avoided looking directly at the dance floor. Edmund turned to her, and for a moment his expression carried a complicated mixture of emotions she could not fully identify. "My uncle approached me again earlier this week," he admitted. "He has arranged for me to meet with the daughter of a prominent family from the north, apparently believing she would make a suitable match for securing the Ashcombe line." Charlotte felt her chest tighten at this news, though she worked to keep her expression neutral, understanding that showing too much emotion in such a public setting would only invite further gossip. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I had no interest in meeting her," Edmund said firmly, though he did not receive that answer well. "He reminded me, at considerable length, of my obligations to the family name and the practical necessities of producing an heir." "That must have been difficult to hear," Charlotte said carefully. "It was," Edmund admitted. "Though not for the reasons my uncle believes. I have no difficulty understanding the practical necessities he describes. My difficulty lies in the fact that my heart has already chosen a direction entirely different from what practicality demands." Charlotte's breath caught slightly at his words, understanding their meaning even though he had not stated it explicitly in such a public setting. Before she could respond, however, the orchestra began a new piece, and she noticed several guests turning to watch them with poorly disguised curiosity, clearly having witnessed enough of their private exchange to draw their own conclusions. Edmund noticed the attention as well, his jaw tightening slightly as he glanced around the crowded room. For years, he had avoided precisely this kind of public scrutiny, retreating instead into careful isolation whenever possible. Yet tonight, something within him seemed to shift, a quiet determination replacing his usual instinct toward withdrawal. "Miss Winters," he said, his voice carrying slightly louder than their previous private conversation, loud enough that several nearby guests clearly overheard his words, "would you honor me with this dance?" Charlotte stared at him in genuine surprise, understanding the significance of what he was asking. This would be his first dance in 3 years, the first time he had willingly stepped onto a dance floor since his wife's passing, and he was choosing to do so publicly, in front of an audience already primed to gossip about their connection. "Are you certain, Your Grace?" she asked quietly, wanting to give him an opportunity to reconsider before committing to something so significant and so public. "I have never been more certain of anything," Edmund replied, extending his hand toward her with a steadiness that belied the obvious nervousness still visible in his expression. Charlotte placed her hand in his without further hesitation, feeling the warmth of his fingers close gently around her own as he led her toward the dance floor. The room seemed to grow quieter around them, though Charlotte suspected this was merely her own perception heightened by the significance of the moment, rather than any actual change in the ambient noise of the ballroom. As they took their positions among the other dancers, Charlotte noticed several guests whispering behind their fans, their eyes fixed on the unusual sight of the reclusive Duke of Ashcombe finally returning to the dance floor after so many years of careful avoidance. She felt a flash of protective anger toward those watching so openly, wishing they might simply allow this moment to belong to Edmund alone, without the weight of public judgment attached to it. Edmund, however, seemed to notice none of this scrutiny. His attention focused entirely on Charlotte as the music began, and they started their first tentative steps together. His movements were slightly stiff at first, clearly out of practice after years without dancing, but Charlotte matched his pace patiently, offering gentle encouragement through small smiles and quiet words whenever he seemed to hesitate. "You are doing wonderfully," she murmured as they moved through the initial steps of the dance. "I feel as though I have forgotten everything I once knew," Edmund admitted, a nervous laugh escaping him, so unfamiliar and rare that several nearby dancers glanced over in obvious surprise at the sound. "Dancing is like most things worth doing," Charlotte said. "It becomes easier the less you worry about doing it perfectly." Edmund seemed to take her words to heart, his movements gradually growing more confident as the dance progressed, his initial stiffness melting away as he allowed himself to simply enjoy the music and the company rather than focusing on flawless execution. Charlotte found herself smiling genuinely as they moved together, appreciating the way his expression had transformed from nervous uncertainty into something closer to genuine joy. For a few precious minutes, surrounded by dozens of curious onlookers, Charlotte and Edmund existed within their own private world, focused entirely on each other rather than the whispers and speculation surrounding them. She could see in his eyes the same quiet wonder she felt herself, the recognition that something significant was happening between them, something neither of them fully understood yet, but both were unwilling to dismiss or ignore. As the dance concluded, Edmund bowed formally, though his eyes remained fixed on Charlotte with an intensity that suggested far more than simple politeness. The surrounding guests applauded politely, as was customary, though Charlotte noticed several exchanging significant glances, clearly already composing the gossip they would share with friends and family in the days to come. "Thank you," Edmund said quietly, once the applause had died down and the orchestra had transitioned into a new piece for other dancers to enjoy. "For what?" Charlotte asked, echoing the question she had once posed to him weeks earlier beside the refreshment table. "For extending your hand toward me when I did not believe myself capable of accepting it," he said. "For showing me that dancing again did not mean forgetting what came before, but simply meant allowing new joy to exist alongside old grief." Charlotte felt tears threatening once again, though she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to create a scene in such a public setting. "I only offered my hand, Your Grace," she said softly. "You were the one brave enough to accept it." They stood together near the edge of the dance floor for several more minutes, engaged in quiet conversation while other couples continued dancing around them. Eventually, Margaret approached, her expression carrying obvious delight at having witnessed her brother's first dance in years. "I have not seen you smile like that in a very long time, Edmund," she said, embracing her brother briefly before turning to Charlotte with genuine warmth. "Thank you, Miss Winters, for whatever magic you have worked upon my stubborn brother." "I have worked no magic, Lady Margaret," Charlotte replied, though she could not entirely suppress her own smile. "Your brother found his own courage tonight. I simply happened to be standing nearby when he did." The remainder of the evening passed in a pleasant blur for Charlotte, filled with continued conversation, another dance shared with Edmund later in the night, and the growing awareness that their connection had shifted into something neither of them could easily dismiss or hide from public knowledge any longer. She noticed the whispers continuing throughout the evening, felt the weight of curious glances following them wherever they moved together, but found herself caring less about such scrutiny than she might have expected. As the ball finally drew to a close and guests began making their departures, Edmund walked Charlotte and Lady Fenwick to their waiting carriage, his expression carrying a quiet contentment that Charlotte had not witnessed from him before this evening. "I hope tonight marks the beginning of something significant, Miss Winters," he said quietly, careful to keep his words private even as Lady Fenwick climbed into the carriage ahead of them, granting them a brief moment of relative privacy. "As do I, Your Grace," Charlotte replied honestly. "Edmund," he said softly, "please, when we are speaking privately, I would prefer you call me Edmund." Charlotte smiled warmly at this small but significant gesture of intimacy. "Then you must call me Charlotte in return." "Charlotte," he repeated, testing the sound of her name with obvious pleasure. "I look forward to our next conversation whenever circumstances allow it." As Charlotte settled into the carriage beside Lady Fenwick, and the vehicle began its journey back toward the Fenwick townhouse, she found herself replaying every moment of the evening in her mind, particularly the warmth of Edmund's hand in hers as they danced together for the first time. She understood, with growing certainty, that whatever complications lay ahead regarding his family's expectations and society's judgment, she could no longer imagine turning away from the connection developing between them. Lady Fenwick studied her quietly throughout the carriage ride, saying nothing for several minutes before finally breaking the comfortable silence between them. "The entire ballroom witnessed that dance tonight, Charlotte. There will be no pretending such a connection does not exist, not anymore." "I know," Charlotte said simply, though her tone carried no regret, only quiet acceptance of whatever consequences might follow from the evening's events. "Are you prepared for what comes next?" Lady Fenwick asked gently. "The gossip, the scrutiny, the potential opposition from his family." Charlotte considered the question seriously, understanding the genuine concern behind her cousin's words. "I do not know if I am fully prepared," she admitted. "But I know that whatever difficulties lie ahead, I would rather face them honestly than continue pretending my feelings for Edmund do not exist simply because they are inconvenient or complicated." Lady Fenwick smiled softly, reaching over to squeeze Charlotte's hand in quiet support. "Then I suppose we shall face whatever comes together, my dear." As the carriage continued its journey through the quiet London streets, Charlotte allowed herself to feel genuine hope for the first time since arriving in the city. Hope that perhaps the honest connection she had found with Edmund might prove strong enough to withstand whatever challenges society and his family's expectations might soon place before them. The days following the Whitmore ball brought exactly the kind of attention Lady Fenwick had predicted, though even her cautious warnings had not fully prepared Charlotte for the intensity of gossip that soon consumed much of London society. Wherever she went, whispers followed, some curious, some openly hostile, all fixated on the unlikely connection between a merchant's daughter and one of the kingdom's most prominent dukes. Lady Priscilla Vane, a woman known throughout society for her sharp tongue and her tendency to position herself at the center of every significant scandal, quickly emerged as the loudest voice among those questioning Charlotte's intentions. She had long harbored ambitions of securing Edmund's attention for her own niece, a young woman of impeccable lineage who had been carefully positioned throughout the season as a suitable match for the grieving Duke. "It is simply improper," Lady Vane declared loudly at a tea gathering Charlotte attended several days after the ball, her voice carrying deliberately across the room to ensure Charlotte overheard every word. "A merchant's daughter, however clever she believes herself to be, cannot possibly understand what is required to properly manage a household as significant as Ashcombe Hall. She is clearly scheming for a title far above her station." Charlotte forced herself to remain composed, continuing her conversation with the other women seated near her despite the obvious insult directed her way. She had anticipated such reactions, had prepared herself mentally for the possibility of open hostility from those who believed she had overstepped boundaries that society had carefully constructed to keep people in their proper places. Yet knowing such attacks might come did little to lessen the sting when they actually arrived. Charlotte felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of anger and humiliation, though she refused to give Lady Vane the satisfaction of witnessing any visible reaction to her deliberately cruel words. The situation grew more difficult over the following days, as similar comments and pointed remarks followed Charlotte to nearly every social gathering she attended. Some women who had previously treated her with polite friendliness now maintained careful distance, apparently unwilling to associate too closely with someone at the center of such significant controversy. Others seemed almost eager to befriend her, though Charlotte suspected their sudden interest stemmed more from curiosity about the scandal than genuine affection. Lady Fenwick did her best to shield Charlotte from the worst of the gossip, declining several invitations she suspected were designed primarily to allow hostesses the opportunity to interrogate Charlotte about her intentions toward the Duke. But even her cousin's careful protection could not entirely insulate Charlotte from the growing pressure surrounding their situation. Edmund, for his part, faced his own significant challenges as news of their dance spread throughout his family and social circle. His uncle, the same relative who had previously pressed him regarding suitable matches for remarriage, arrived at Ashcombe Hall within days of the ball, clearly intent on addressing what he considered a serious threat to the family's reputation and future prospects. "You cannot seriously be considering pursuing this merchant's daughter," his uncle said sharply, pacing the length of Edmund's study while Edmund remained seated behind his desk, watching with carefully controlled patience. "The Ashcombe name carries centuries of tradition and standing. You cannot simply discard that legacy because a clever young woman has managed to capture your attention." "I am not discarding anything," Edmund replied evenly, though his jaw remained tight with barely suppressed frustration. "I am simply allowing myself the possibility of happiness after years of grief, regardless of whether that happiness aligns perfectly with family expectations." "Happiness?" his uncle repeated with obvious disdain. "Edmund, dukes do not marry for happiness. They marry for duty, for the preservation of their family's legacy and standing. Surely 3 years of mourning has not erased everything you were raised to understand about your responsibilities." Edmund felt anger building within him, a rare emotion he had rarely allowed himself to express so openly since Isabel's passing. "I understand my responsibilities perfectly well, uncle. I have fulfilled every duty required of me since inheriting this title, often at considerable personal cost. Surely I am permitted some measure of personal happiness alongside those responsibilities." "Not if that happiness threatens the very legacy you are meant to preserve," his uncle countered sharply. "Marriage to a woman without appropriate connections or standing will damage the Ashcombe name irreparably. Other prominent families will question your judgment, will hesitate to align themselves with a house that has apparently abandoned its own traditions." The argument continued for nearly an hour, neither man willing to fully concede ground to the other's position. Edmund found himself growing increasingly frustrated, not merely with his uncle's rigid adherence to tradition, but with the broader realization that pursuing genuine happiness with Charlotte would likely require confronting similar opposition from nearly every corner of his extended family and social circle. After his uncle finally departed, still clearly dissatisfied with the conversation's outcome, Edmund remained alone in his study for a long while, considering the difficult path that apparently lay ahead should he choose to continue pursuing his growing feelings for Charlotte. He understood the legitimate concerns underlying his family's opposition, recognized that his choices carried consequences extending far beyond his own personal happiness. Yet he also could not deny the genuine transformation Charlotte's presence had brought into his life, the way her honesty and warmth had gradually drawn him back from years of isolated grief into something resembling genuine engagement with life once again. Meanwhile, Charlotte faced her own difficult reckoning with the situation's complications. Her father, Mr. Winters, arrived unexpectedly at Lady Fenwick's townhouse several days after news of the scandal reached him through business associates who had heard the gossip circulating through London society. "Charlotte, what is this I am hearing about your connection with the Duke of Ashcombe?" he asked, his expression carrying a mixture of concern and confusion as they sat together in Lady Fenwick's drawing room. Charlotte explained the situation as honestly as she could, describing her growing friendship with Edmund and the genuine affection that had developed between them over the preceding weeks. Her father listened carefully, his expression growing increasingly troubled as her explanation continued. "Charlotte, I sent you to London hoping you might find a respectable match, someone who would provide security and stability for your future," he said finally. "I did not anticipate you becoming entangled in such a public scandal, nor did I anticipate you pursuing a connection with someone whose family would so clearly oppose your involvement." "I did not seek this connection deliberately, father," Charlotte replied. "It simply developed naturally through honest conversation and genuine understanding. I cannot pretend such feelings do not exist simply because they prove inconvenient. Feelings alone will not protect you from the very real consequences of continued involvement with a man whose family so clearly opposes your presence in his life," her father said, his tone carrying genuine worry rather than anger. "What happens if his family's opposition proves too strong, if society's judgment becomes too severe? I do not wish to see you hurt, Charlotte, nor do I wish to see our family's reputation damaged by association with such a public controversy." Charlotte understood her father's concerns, recognized the legitimate worry underlying his words. Yet she also could not bring herself to regret the connection she had found with Edmund, regardless of the difficulties currently surrounding their situation. "I understand the risks, father," she said quietly. "But I would rather face those risks honestly than retreat from something that feels genuinely significant simply because it proves difficult or inconvenient." Her father studied her for a long moment, apparently recognizing the same stubborn determination he had witnessed in his daughter throughout her entire life. "You have always been headstrong, Charlotte, even as a child," he said finally, a reluctant smile touching his lips despite his obvious concern. "I suppose I should not be surprised that you would pursue your own path, regardless of the obstacles placed before you." Their conversation offered Charlotte little practical resolution regarding the challenges she and Edmund continued facing, but it provided some measure of comfort knowing her father, despite his concerns, was not entirely opposed to her pursuing genuine happiness, even if that pursuit came with significant complications. The following week brought further difficulties, as Lady Vane's campaign against Charlotte's reputation intensified considerably. Rumors began circulating that Charlotte had deliberately targeted Edmund from their very first encounter, calculating his vulnerability following years of grief as an opportunity to secure a title and fortune far beyond what her own family's modest wealth could provide. Other whispers suggested she had used inappropriate tactics to capture his attention, implications that struck at Charlotte's character in ways that felt deeply unfair given the genuine honesty that had characterized her entire connection with Edmund. Charlotte found herself increasingly isolated as the gossip continued spreading, with fewer invitations arriving and more social circles apparently choosing to distance themselves from the growing controversy surrounding her name. Even Lady Fenwick, despite her continued loyalty and support, began showing signs of strain under the constant pressure of defending her young cousin against such persistent and increasingly vicious rumors. It was during this particularly difficult period that Charlotte began seriously considering whether continuing her connection with Edmund was truly fair to either of them, given the mounting consequences she witnessed spreading through both their lives. She loved him, she realized with growing certainty, though she had not yet spoken such words aloud to him directly. But love alone might not prove sufficient to overcome the significant obstacles society and his family continued placing before them. She wondered, in her most difficult moments of doubt, whether the kindest choice might actually be withdrawal, removing herself from Edmund's life before the damage to his reputation and family legacy became irreparable, before her own family's name became permanently associated with a scandal that showed no signs of diminishing regardless of how much time passed. These doubts weighed heavily on Charlotte's mind as she prepared for what would prove to be one of the most significant conversations of her young life, uncertain whether the path forward with Edmund remained truly possible, or whether circumstances beyond their control might ultimately force them apart despite whatever genuine feelings had grown between them. Edmund noticed the change in Charlotte before she said a single word about it directly. When they finally managed to arrange a private meeting in the quiet garden of Lady Fenwick's townhouse where they could speak without immediate fear of prying ears, her usual confident directness seemed muted, replaced by a careful hesitance that troubled him deeply. "You seem distant today, Charlotte," he observed as they walked slowly along a narrow garden path, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed hedges surrounding them. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment before responding, clearly choosing her words carefully. "I have been thinking a great deal about the difficulties our connection has created, Edmund. For your family, for society's perception of you, for my own family's reputation as well." Edmund felt a familiar tightness building in his chest, recognizing the direction this conversation seemed to be heading. "What are you saying, Charlotte?" "I am saying that perhaps continuing this connection is unfair to both of us," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the gravel path rather than meeting his gaze directly. "Perhaps the kindest choice, for everyone involved, would be for me to withdraw from your life before the damage becomes permanent." Edmund stopped walking abruptly, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying a mixture of alarm and quiet determination. "Is that truly what you wish, Charlotte? To withdraw from whatever connection exists between us?" Charlotte finally met his gaze, and Edmund could see genuine anguish visible in her expression, evidence that this decision, whatever it might ultimately become, was not one she had reached easily or without significant internal struggle. "I do not wish it," she admitted honestly, "but I fear continuing forward might cause more harm than good, particularly for you and your family's legacy." Edmund considered her words carefully, understanding the genuine concern underlying her hesitation. He thought of his uncle's persistent opposition, of the growing gossip he had heard whispered throughout his own social circles regarding Charlotte's supposed intentions and character. He thought of the weeks since Isabel's passing when he had retreated entirely into isolated grief, unable to imagine any path forward that did not involve permanent solitude and careful avoidance of genuine connection with anyone. Then he thought of Charlotte's hand extending toward his own at that first crucial moment, offering him an invitation to step back into life he had believed himself incapable of accepting. He thought of their conversation beside the fountain, her honest admission about grief not following any calendar. He thought of their dance at the Whitmore ball, the genuine joy he had felt for the first time in years, standing on that dance floor with her hand in his despite the weight of curious onlookers surrounding them. "Charlotte," he said finally, his voice carrying a quiet determination that surprised even himself, "I spent 3 years allowing fear to dictate every aspect of my existence. Fear of remembering, fear of forgetting, fear of moving forward and somehow betraying Isabel's memory in the process. That fear cost me years of genuine living, years I can never reclaim regardless of how much I might wish otherwise." He paused, reaching gently for her hand, relieved when she did not pull away from his touch. "I do not wish to allow fear to dictate my future any longer, not fear of my family's disapproval, not fear of society's judgment, and certainly not fear of the genuine happiness I have found in your presence these past months. I understand the difficulties our connection has created. I do not dismiss them lightly, but I refuse to sacrifice something genuinely meaningful simply because pursuing it proves complicated or uncomfortable." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, though she made no attempt to hide them this time, allowing Edmund to witness the full depth of emotion his words had evoked within her. "Edmund, your family's legacy, your uncle's expectations, will need to adjust to my own choices regarding my future happiness," Edmund interrupted gently but firmly. "I have spent enough years living according to others' expectations, first through years of careful grief that satisfied society's assumptions about proper mourning, and now potentially through a marriage arranged purely for practical convenience rather than genuine affection. I do not wish to continue that pattern any longer." "But the gossip, the scandal," Charlotte began, "will eventually fade, as all gossip eventually does," Edmund said. "London society thrives on scandal precisely because new scandals continuously emerge to replace old ones. I do not intend to allow temporary controversy to determine permanent choices regarding my happiness." Charlotte studied him carefully, apparently searching for any hesitation or uncertainty within his expression, finding instead only quiet, unwavering conviction. "You truly mean this," she said finally, her voice carrying wonder rather than doubt. "I have never meant anything more sincerely," Edmund confirmed. "Charlotte, these past months with you have taught me that grief and joy can indeed exist simultaneously within the same heart, exactly as you once suggested to me. You have given me permission to remember Isabel with love rather than only pain, while also allowing myself to build new happiness moving forward. I do not wish to lose that gift simply because pursuing it publicly proves difficult." Tears continued falling freely down Charlotte's cheeks now, though her expression carried unmistakable hope rather than sorrow. "I love you, Edmund," she said softly, the words emerging with the same directness that had characterized her very first conversation with him weeks earlier. "I have loved you for some time now, though I confess I have been afraid to speak such words aloud given everything surrounding our situation." "I love you as well, Charlotte," Edmund replied, his own voice thick with emotion he had not allowed himself to express so openly in years. "I believe I have loved you since that very first evening, when you extended your hand toward mine despite everyone's warnings about my reputation and my grief." They stood together in the quiet garden for several long moments, the weight of their mutual admission settling comfortably between them, offering a sense of clarity and purpose that had been missing throughout the difficult weeks preceding this conversation. Edmund knew significant challenges still awaited them, that his family's opposition would not simply disappear because he had made his personal choice clear, that society's gossip would likely continue regardless of his own determination to move forward. But for the first time since Isabel's passing, Edmund felt genuinely certain about the path forward, understanding with complete clarity that whatever difficulties lay ahead, facing them alongside Charlotte felt infinitely preferable to retreating back into the isolated safety of solitary grief he had maintained for far too long. "I intend to speak with my uncle directly," Edmund said finally, his tone carrying quiet resolve. "I intend to make my intentions toward you entirely clear, regardless of his continued objections. And I intend to defend your character publicly against whatever malicious gossip Lady Vane and others continue spreading throughout society." "Edmund, that will only intensify the scandal further," Charlotte cautioned, though her expression carried more hope than genuine worry now. "Perhaps," Edmund acknowledged, "but I would rather face intensified scandal built upon honest truth than continue allowing quiet retreat and careful avoidance to protect a peace that was never genuine in the first place. I am done hiding from difficult truths, Charlotte, whether they concern my grief or my growing love for you." Charlotte smiled through her remaining tears, the expression carrying genuine warmth and relief. "Then I suppose we shall face whatever comes together, exactly as Lady Fenwick suggested we might need to do." "Together," Edmund agreed, squeezing her hand gently before releasing it, mindful of maintaining appropriate distance should any other guests wander into the garden unexpectedly. "Whatever challenges remain ahead of us, I intend to face them honestly, without the careful pretense and quiet avoidance that has characterized far too much of my life these past 3 years. As their conversation concluded, and they made their way back toward the main house, both aware that significant challenges still awaited them in the days and weeks ahead, Charlotte felt a profound sense of relief and hope settling within her chest. Whatever difficulties Edmund's family and London society might continue placing before them, she now understood with complete certainty that neither of them intended to retreat from the genuine connection they had built together, regardless of how complicated or uncomfortable that connection might prove for others to accept. The path forward remained uncertain, filled with obstacles neither of them could fully anticipate or control. But for the first time since this entire situation began, Charlotte felt confident that whatever came next, she and Edmund would face it together, united by a love that had proven strong enough to overcome years of grief, weeks of vicious gossip, and the persistent opposition of a family determined to prioritize tradition over genuine happiness. True to his word, Edmund requested a meeting with his uncle within days of his conversation with Charlotte in the garden. This time, he did not wait passively behind his desk while his uncle paced and lectured him about family duty and tradition. Instead, Edmund stood firmly, his posture carrying a confidence and clarity that his uncle had not witnessed from him since before Isabel's passing. "I intend to pursue a future with Charlotte Winters," Edmund stated plainly, before his uncle could launch into another lengthy argument about practical considerations and family legacy. "I understand your concerns regarding tradition and appropriate standing, uncle, but I have made my decision, and I do not intend to reconsider it based on family pressure alone." His uncle stared at him, clearly surprised by the firm resolve evident in Edmund's tone, so different from the quiet, grief-worn man he had grown accustomed to dealing with over recent years. "Edmund, you cannot simply dismiss centuries of family tradition based on a passing infatuation with an unsuitable young woman." "She is not unsuitable, uncle," Edmund replied firmly. "She is honest, intelligent, and compassionate, qualities I have found sorely lacking among most of the suitable candidates you and others have attempted to introduce me to over these past years. I would rather build a genuine, loving marriage with Charlotte than a hollow, practical arrangement with someone chosen purely for her family connections and social standing." The argument continued for some time, though Edmund noticed his uncle's resistance gradually softening, as he continued expressing his genuine conviction and happiness regarding his future with Charlotte. Eventually, his uncle sighed heavily, clearly recognizing that further argument would prove futile against such determined resolve. "You have always been stubborn, Edmund, much like your father before you," his uncle said finally, a reluctant note of something resembling respect entering his tone. "I suppose I cannot fault you for choosing happiness over practical convenience, even if I continue to have reservations about how society will receive such a match." "Society's opinion will adjust in time, uncle, exactly as it always eventually does," Edmund replied. "I would rather face temporary controversy than permanent regret over a life built on convenient practicality rather than genuine love." With his uncle's reluctant, if incomplete, acceptance secured, Edmund turned his attention toward addressing the vicious gossip that had continued spreading throughout London society regarding Charlotte's character and supposed intentions. He began attending social events with renewed purpose, speaking openly and confidently about his genuine affection for Charlotte whenever the topic arose, refusing to allow malicious rumors to continue unchallenged. At a gathering hosted by mutual acquaintances several days later, Edmund finally confronted Lady Vane directly, choosing a moment when several other prominent society members were present to witness the exchange. "I understand you have expressed considerable concern regarding Miss Winter's character and intentions, Lady Vane," he said, his tone polite but carrying an unmistakable edge of warning. Lady Vane, clearly caught off guard by his direct address, attempted to maintain her usual composed superiority. "I have simply expressed the concerns many share regarding the appropriateness of such an unusual match, Your Grace." "I would ask that you cease spreading such concerns in the future," Edmund replied firmly, his voice carrying clearly enough that several nearby guests could not help but overhear the exchange. "Miss Winters possesses more genuine integrity and honesty than most individuals I have encountered throughout my years in society. I would consider any continued attacks upon her character a direct insult toward myself as well, given my genuine affection and respect for her." The room fell notably quiet following this exchange, several guests exchanging significant glances as they absorbed the clear message behind Edmund's words. Lady Vane, recognizing the shifted dynamics now working against her continued campaign, offered a stiff, insincere apology before quickly excusing herself from the gathering entirely. News of this confrontation spread quickly throughout London society, and Charlotte noticed an immediate shift in how others treated her following Edmund's public defense. While some continued harboring private reservations about the match, the open hostility and vicious gossip that had characterized recent weeks gradually diminished considerably, replaced by cautious curiosity rather than outright condemnation. Over the following weeks, Edmund and Charlotte continued their courtship with growing confidence and openness, no longer feeling the need to carefully hide their affection from public view. They attended events together regularly, danced whenever opportunities arose, and gradually, London society began accepting the reality of their genuine connection, even if certain traditional circles maintained lingering reservations about the unconventional match. Lady Fenwick, watching this transformation with obvious pride and relief, remarked to Charlotte one afternoon that she had never witnessed society's opinion shift so dramatically within such a short period. "Love has a way of eventually overcoming even the most stubborn resistance, my dear," she said warmly. though I confess I did not anticipate witnessing such a transformation quite so quickly. As the London season drew toward its conclusion, with many families preparing to depart for their country estates during the quieter summer months, Edmund arranged one final grand event at Ashcombe Hall, a ball intended to celebrate the season's conclusion while also serving a deeper, more personal purpose he had not yet revealed to anyone beyond his closest family members. The evening of the final ball arrived with all the elegant preparation and anticipation that had characterized Edmund's earlier event months before, though this time, the atmosphere throughout Ashcombe Hall carried a distinctly different energy, one filled with genuine warmth and celebration, rather than the careful, obligatory formality that had once defined every gathering Edmund hosted. Charlotte arrived alongside Lady Fenwick, both women greeted warmly by Margaret, who had become genuinely close with Charlotte throughout the preceding months. The ballroom itself looked even more magnificent than Charlotte remembered from their previous encounter here, filled with elegant decorations and the warm glow of countless candles reflecting off polished surfaces throughout the grand room. As the evening progressed, filled with dancing, laughter, and genuine celebration among London's assembled elite, Charlotte found herself repeatedly drawn back to memories of that very first evening months earlier, when she had first noticed Edmund standing alone near the shadowed edges of a crowded ballroom, his grief evident despite his careful attempts to maintain composed distance from those around him. How different everything felt now, she realized with quiet wonder, watching Edmund move confidently through his own ballroom, engaging warmly with guests, occasionally catching her eye across the crowded room with a smile that carried genuine happiness rather than the careful, controlled expression he had once maintained throughout every public appearance. Near midnight, as the orchestra began a particularly beautiful waltz, Edmund made his way directly toward Charlotte, who stood near the same tall windows where she had first observed him months earlier. This time, however, he crossed the entire length of the ballroom openly, in full view of every guest present, extending his hand toward her with unmistakable confidence and purpose. "Miss Winters," he said, his voice carrying clearly enough that nearby guests could not help but notice the significance of the moment, "would you do me the honor of this dance?" Charlotte smiled warmly, accepting his hand without hesitation. "I would be delighted, Your Grace." As they moved together onto the dance floor, surrounded by other couples but somehow existing within their own private world, Charlotte felt the same warmth and joy she had experienced during their very first dance together at the Whitmore Ball, though this time, without the underlying anxiety and uncertainty that had accompanied that earlier, more tentative beginning. Midway through the waltz, Edmund guided them gently toward the center of the dance floor, then, to Charlotte's genuine surprise, brought their movement to a gradual stop, prompting the orchestra to quiet their playing slightly as guests throughout the ballroom began noticing the unusual pause in the dance. "Charlotte," Edmund said, his voice carrying clearly through the now quieter ballroom, "these past months with you have taught me that genuine happiness remains possible even after profound loss, that love can grow alongside grief rather than requiring its complete absence. You extended your hand toward mine when I believed myself incapable of accepting such kindness, and in doing so, you gave me back a life I had believed lost forever." Charlotte's breath caught as she realized the significance of what was unfolding before the entire assembled gathering, tears already beginning to form at the corners of her eyes as Edmund continued speaking. "I do not wish to spend another moment pretending that my feelings for you are anything less than complete devotion," Edmund continued, slowly lowering himself onto one knee before her, drawing gasps of surprise and delight from the surrounding guests who had gathered to witness this unexpected moment. "Charlotte Winters, would you honor me by becoming my wife, by allowing me to spend the remainder of my life demonstrating the same courage and honesty you showed me on that very first evening we met?" Charlotte felt tears streaming freely down her cheeks now, overwhelming joy replacing any lingering uncertainty about their future together. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying clearly enough for everyone present to hear. "Yes, Edmund, I would be honored to become your wife." The ballroom erupted into applause and delighted exclamations as Edmund rose to his feet, gently wiping away Charlotte's tears before drawing her into a warm embrace, careful to maintain appropriate decorum, despite the overwhelming happiness evident in both their expressions. Margaret rushed forward immediately, embracing them both with genuine joy, while Lady Fenwick dabbed at her own eyes, clearly moved by witnessing the culmination of a connection she had supported despite significant risk to her own reputation throughout the preceding months. Even those guests who had previously harbored reservations about the match found themselves swept up in the genuine romance and happiness of the moment, offering warm congratulations rather than continued skepticism regarding the couple's future together. As the celebration continued throughout the remainder of the evening, with guests offering enthusiastic congratulations and the orchestra playing with renewed energy befitting such a joyous announcement, Charlotte found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. From a curious observer standing quietly at the edge of her very first London ballroom, to now standing as the future Duchess of Ashcombe, engaged to a man whose genuine love and respect she treasured beyond any title or social standing his position might offer. She thought of that very first evening, of extending her hand toward a grieving stranger despite every warning about his reputation and his sorrow. She thought of the courage it had taken for Edmund to accept that invitation, to slowly rediscover joy and connection after years of believing such things forever lost to him. And she thought of the challenges they had faced together throughout recent months, the vicious gossip and family opposition that had threatened to separate them before their connection had fully blossomed into the genuine love now being celebrated so publicly throughout Ashcombe Hall. Later that evening, as the celebration finally began winding down and guests started making their departures, Edmund found a quiet moment alone with Charlotte near the same fountain in his gardens, where they had once shared an honest conversation about grief and loss months earlier. "Do you remember what you told me here, that very first time we spoke privately?" Edmund asked, his hand gently entwined with hers as they stood beneath the moonlit sky. "I told you that grief does not follow anyone's calendar," Charlotte recalled softly. "You did," Edmund confirmed, "and you were entirely correct. My grief for Isabel never fully disappeared, nor do I believe it ever will completely. But you taught me that such grief need not prevent genuine happiness from growing alongside it, that both can exist within the same heart without one diminishing the other." Charlotte smiled warmly, leaning her head gently against his shoulder as they continued standing together beside the quiet fountain. "I am grateful every day that I found the courage to extend my hand toward you that first evening, Edmund. Whatever challenges we faced afterward, I have never once regretted taking that risk." "Nor have I regretted accepting it," Edmund replied softly, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "You gave me back my life, Charlotte, and I intend to spend the remainder of my days ensuring you never regret the courage it took to offer me that chance." As they stood together beneath the star-filled sky, the sounds of the departing celebration fading gradually into comfortable quiet around them, both Charlotte and Edmund understood that their journey together was only truly beginning, filled with continued challenges and adjustments as they prepared to build a shared life together. Yet neither felt any uncertainty or doubt regarding the path forward, understanding with complete confidence that whatever difficulties might still await them, they would face every obstacle together, united by a love strong enough to overcome grief, gossip, family opposition, and every other challenge society might place before them. Their wedding, held several months later at a small, intimate ceremony attended by close family and friends, rather than the grand society spectacle many had expected, marked not an ending but a genuine beginning, the start of a partnership built on honesty, mutual respect, and a love that had proven strong enough to bridge the significant differences between their two very different worlds. And though London society would continue discussing their unconventional match for years to come, most eventually came to recognize what those closest to the couple had understood from the very beginning, that Edmund Ashworth and Charlotte Winters had found something far more valuable than convenient social arrangement or practical family alliance. They had found genuine love, built upon honest conversation, mutual understanding, and the simple courage of a single extended hand on an evening when neither of them had expected their lives to change so completely and so wonderfully forever. In the years that followed their wedding, Charlotte and Edmund built a life together at Ashcombe Hall that neither had believed possible during those difficult early months of gossip and family resistance. The grand estate, once filled with quiet sorrow and careful avoidance of joy, gradually transformed into a warm, welcoming home, filled regularly with laughter, music, and the genuine happiness of a household no longer burdened by unspoken grief. Edmund's uncle, though he never fully abandoned his traditional views regarding suitable marriages, eventually came to respect Charlotte deeply, particularly after witnessing how skillfully she managed the responsibilities of Ashcombe Hall, bringing practical wisdom from her merchant upbringing that proved surprisingly valuable in managing the estate's finances and tenant relationships. He often remarked, in later years, that Edmund's choice had proven far wiser than his own initial objections had suggested. Lady Vane, whose vicious campaign against Charlotte's character had once threatened to derail their entire relationship, eventually found herself facing her own scandal involving her niece's broken engagement, a situation that quietly diminished her standing within London society and effectively silenced her continued criticism of the Ashcombe marriage. Charlotte, despite everything Lady Vane had put her through, chose not to seek any form of revenge or public satisfaction, believing instead that her own happiness with Edmund served as the most complete response to years of malicious gossip. Margaret remained close with both Charlotte and Edmund throughout the years, eventually marrying a kind gentleman she met through Charlotte's expanding social circle, one who valued her intelligence and warmth just as genuinely as Edmund valued similar qualities within his own wife. The two families remained closely connected, their children growing up together, filling Ashcombe Hall with the kind of joyful energy that had been entirely absent during the years of Edmund's isolated grief. Charlotte's father, Mr. Winters, initially uncertain about his daughter's unconventional match, eventually came to view the marriage as one of the great triumphs of his family's history, proud beyond measure watching his daughter navigate the complicated world of aristocratic society with the same honest confidence she had always carried throughout her entire life. He visited Ashcombe Hall regularly, and Edmund came to value his father-in-law's practical business wisdom, often consulting him regarding matters of estate management that traditional aristocratic education had never adequately addressed. Lady Fenwick, who had risked considerable social standing supporting Charlotte throughout the difficult early months of scandal and gossip, found her own reputation ultimately enhanced rather than damaged by her loyal support, as society gradually recognized her role in nurturing one of the season's most genuinely romantic and enduring matches. She remained a beloved figure within Charlotte and Edmund's household for the remainder of her life, cherished as the woman who had first brought Charlotte into London society and provided steady guidance throughout the complicated early stages of her relationship with Edmund. As for Edmund himself, he never forgot the profound transformation that Charlotte's presence had brought into his life, nor did he ever take for granted the courage she had shown in extending her hand toward him on that first fateful evening. He continued honoring Isabel's memory throughout his life, visiting her grave regularly and speaking of her with genuine warmth whenever the topic arose naturally in conversation. Charlotte never once expressed jealousy or discomfort regarding this continued remembrance, understanding deeply that honoring past love did not diminish the genuine devotion Edmund felt toward her in the present. Their marriage, built upon honest communication and mutual respect rather than convenient social arrangement, became something of a quiet legend throughout London society over the following years, often cited as proof that genuine happiness could indeed triumph over rigid tradition and superficial social expectation. Young couples facing similar obstacles regarding unsuitable matches sometimes sought Charlotte and Edmund's counsel, finding comfort and encouragement in their example of choosing authentic love over practical convenience. Charlotte often reflected, particularly during quiet evenings spent together in the same gardens where their relationship had first deepened beyond casual acquaintance, on how remarkably different her life had become from what she had originally anticipated when first arriving in London. She had come seeking simple observation of aristocratic society, curious but largely uninvested in finding any lasting personal connection within that unfamiliar world. Instead, she had found genuine love, a partner who valued her honesty and independence rather than expecting her to conform entirely to society's rigid expectations regarding proper feminine behavior. Edmund, for his part, often remarked to close friends and family that he considered himself the most fortunate man in England, not because of his title or his considerable fortune, but because he had somehow found his way back to genuine happiness after believing such joy permanently lost to him following Isabel's passing. He credited Charlotte entirely with this remarkable transformation, acknowledging freely that without her fearless courage in extending her hand toward him that first evening, he might have remained trapped indefinitely within his own isolated grief, never discovering the genuine happiness that had ultimately defined the remainder of his life. Their story, passed down through subsequent generations of the Ashcombe family, became a cherished reminder that courage and honesty often proved more valuable than adherence to rigid social convention, that genuine love built upon mutual understanding and respect could indeed overcome even the most significant obstacles society might place before it. Charlotte and Edmund's descendants would often hear the story of that first extended hand, that fearless invitation offered to a grieving stranger who found within himself the courage to accept it, transforming both their lives in ways neither had ever anticipated on that seemingly ordinary evening when their paths first crossed within a crowded London ballroom. And so their story concluded not with an ending, but with the quiet, enduring beginning of a genuine partnership built on honesty, courage, and the simple, profound understanding that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is extend their hand toward another, while the bravest thing another person can do is find the courage to accept it, regardless of whatever obstacles or uncertainties might follow that simple, transformative gesture.